So based on the responses I just saw, it sounds like you guys would like the real practical one that you could take and repeat and use it. Okay. So
Please, sir.
let me pull up that PowerPoint, those slides, so I can um, bring those up and use those. Mm. Okay.
So I know some of you have already been to Equip this year. Who hasn't been to Equip yet and is going to? Chelsea. It's in what, 2 weeks? Yeah, we're looking forward to it.
All right.
Yes, me and all of my girls are excited.
Love to hear that.
Hey, Mike, are you able to share your screen?
I can. I'm pulling it up now and I'll share it with
I
you.
was just making sure you had permissions.
And
I was making sure you had permissions to do that.
Sure. Oh, okay. Yeah, please. All right.
Yeah, it's already set to all participants.
Okay, I'm bringing it up now. And oh, let me press share and then I'll bring it up. Okay. All right, you guys can see my screen?
Yep.
All right. I'll tell you what, let me open with some let me open just first with some introductory comments on how this works. Let's stop the share. So I remember when I first started getting interested in apologetics, and I didn't get interested in it deeply. But I was in college. I was probably 21 years old at the time or just before. And I'd heard about Josh McDowell's book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And I asked my parents to get it for me for my birthday. So I was either 20, 21 when they got this for me. And then it might have been that summer. It might have been just a few years later when I was in grad school. I don't remember. But I was still living at home, hadn't got married yet. And so I was home during the summer between semesters. And my parents would always take us for vacation to the beach. We lived in Baltimore, Maryland. So they would take us to Ocean City, Maryland, which was about a 3-hour drive to the shore. And one night, my sister and I, the older of my two sisters and I, were walking along the boardwalk. And at some point, we came to this old hotel that was sandwiched between two larger hotels. And this hotel was probably 3 or 4 stories high. And the patio was all lit up, and there was a crowd of maybe 30 to 40 people around just looking at something. And so my sister and I said, hey, let's go over and check out to see what's going on. So we looked, and there was this artist. He had taken all day, and he had done this beautiful colorful chalk artistry, this portrait of Jesus, this head, just his head with the crown of thorns, and it looked, tortured face and blood and everything coming down it. And like I said, there were about 30 to 40 people around that were just looking at this, and they were real quiet. It was a real somber moment. And so my sister and I said, let's go up and talk to the artist. And so we did. And I got up there and I said, hey, brother, man, this thing looks fantastic. And he said, well, thanks. And I said, you've really done a great job. And this is a great ministry you have. All these people coming and just looking at this. And do you ever share the gospel? And he said, no, I don't. And I said, why? And he said, well, I'm just kind of shy. I said, wow, I can kind of understand it. But, you know, you've got an audience here and you have earned their respect. And so why not share the gospel with them? He says, I can't. And I said, but if you don't share the gospel with them, they're not going to hear it. And he said, well, why don't you share it then? I said, me? I don't have any standing with these people. I haven't done anything. They don't respect me. They respect you because you've done this. He said, well, if you don't do it, they're not going to hear it. And I'd never done anything like this before, ever in my life. But I thought, you know, this guy's right. And I remember reading evidence that demands a verdict, and I didn't remember much from it. But one thing I did remember was a real simple argument in it that McDowell calls the Lord, Liar, Lunatic argument, which I'm sure all of you are probably familiar with it. And he got that from C.S. Lewis, and Lewis called it the Great Trilemma. And so I figured, well, I'm going to do this. I'm going to use the Lord, Liar, Lunatic. That's the only argument I knew at that point. And so I put my two hands up and I said, excuse me, everyone, can I have your attention? And they looked at me. And then I looked at the face of Jesus and I pointed to it and I said, this same Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. And at that point, there was this guy, this shirtless guy on the second floor of that hotel. And he came out. He was almost certainly drunk or high on drugs. And he came out on his balcony and he looked at me and he pointed at me and he said, shut the F up. And it's like, whoa. So what do I do here? Like I said, I'd never did anything like this before. And I just ignored him. And I went on and he walked back in and never said another thing. So I said, this Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. Now we have two options here. Either he was the Son of God or he was not the Son of God. Now, if he was not the Son of God, he either knew he wasn't the Son of God, which means he really believed he was, which means he was a lunatic, or he knew he wasn't the Son of God. In other words, he was lying. Well, maybe some of you are thinking, you know, Jesus, you don't think he was a lunatic, you don't think he was a liar, but maybe, you know, he's not the Son of God. Well, that's not really the option we have. If he claimed to be the Son of God and he was not, he either knew he wasn't or he believed he was. And if both of those are wrong, that leaves us with one other option. Jesus claimed to be the Son of God and he is. And that gives us something very serious on which to ponder. Thank you for your attention. And I turned to the artist and he said, wow, that was great. Thanks. I said, well, thanks for challenging me to do it. And God bless you, brother. And my sister and I walked on. Well, the beauty of that argument, of the Lord, Liar, Lunatic argument, is that it is simple and it is crystal clear. It is very, very simple and it's easy to remember. So I got thinking about this a few years ago. Let's say that you're with some colleagues at work and a bunch of you go out to lunch and one of them's an atheist and the atheist says, you know, I don't mean to belittle you Christians, but I don't know how you can believe someone rose from the dead when it's the 21st century. We've been to the moon. We have sent satellites to Pluto and beyond. We can see billions and billions of light years into our universe and see stars that far away. We have mobile phones. We can do all kinds of stuff. And yet you still want to believe a myth that someone rose from the dead. And you're sitting there at lunch and you're thinking to yourself, wow, that is, I know that there's evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. I know I've heard lectures on it. Perhaps I've even read books, but I don't know what to say here. What if you had an argument for the resurrection of Jesus that was so clear, but like Lewis's argument, it was so clear, and it was almost as simple that you could draw it on a napkin right there at lunch in front of everyone? Could you use something like that? Well, that's what I'm going to give you over the next few minutes here. Okay. So let me do this. Let me share my screen again. And let's see, where are we here? All right, here we go. And I'm going to bring my slides up. All right. There we go. So I teach New Testament and apologetics at Houston Christian University. So here's how we're going to start. And if you get this, the rest of the argument is going to be pretty simple. This is the most important thing right here. And that is Jesus' disciples, his apostles, claimed he rose from the dead and appeared to them. Not just have the apostles claimed he appeared, to be brief, but Jesus' apostles claimed that he rose from the dead and appeared to them. Now notice what I am not saying. I'm not saying that Jesus actually rose from the dead. At this point, I'm not even saying that they believed that he rose from the dead. I'm saying that the apostles claimed he rose from the dead and appeared to them. Now, let me ask you before I go on, is what you're seeing what I'm seeing? All you're seeing right now is a slide. That's all you're seeing on your screen. Is that right? Okay. All right. So they claimed he rose and appeared to them. Now, how do we know that? Well, you've got the Apostle Paul. And as you know, Paul was not a believer when Jesus appeared to him. In fact, he was persecuting the church. He was out arresting Christians, throwing them in jail, and consenting to their execution for being Christians. He believed, and this is according to his own words, he believed that it was God's will for him to help destroy the movement Jesus had started. And what's cool about this is we find this in Paul's undisputed letters. Now, there are 13 letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament. And when I say scholars, I'm referring to Christian scholars, Jewish scholars, agnostic, atheist scholars. I'm talking about everyone, okay? And there are thousands of New Testament scholars in the world today. And I'd venture to say a majority of them are not believers, okay? What I will say too is the majority, the large majority, the consensus of New Testament scholars today, including atheists, agnostics, and Jews, believe that Paul was a non-believer persecuting the church and that he became a Christian as a result. And Paul testifies this in his what are called the undisputed letters of Paul. So of those 13 letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament, 7 of them are regarded as undisputed letters. In other words, there's no dispute over whether Paul wrote them. And then there are 6 letters that scholars dispute over whether Paul wrote them. I'm not here to talk about that. What I am going to say, though, is I'm only going to appeal to those letters of Paul that it's unanimous that Paul wrote them. That way, a skeptic couldn't say, yeah, but Paul didn't actually write that one. No, I'm only going to quote from those letters that he did write, okay? And Paul says that he saw the risen Jesus and became a Christian as a result. Now, there's more to it than that, but that's Paul. What did he say? He said, I delivered to you what I also received. Now, these terms, delivered and received, were used as technical terms for the imparting of oral tradition. And so why do we believe this is oral tradition that Paul is going to quote here in verses 3 through 5? Well, because Paul uses those terms, delivered and received. He delivered it to them when after he had received it from others whom he deemed credible. And almost everyone thinks that that was the Jerusalem apostles. So when did he deliver it to them? Well, it's pretty well agreed by virtually all scholars that Paul established the church in Corinth around the year 51. And that's when he would have delivered this to them. So, of course, he would have had to receive it prior to setting up the church in Corinth. So let's say no later than the year 50. And most scholars think that Paul was converted somewhere between 1 to 5 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, probably more like 2 to 3 years. And so we're only, sometime probably no earlier than 1 year after Jesus's crucifixion, and no later than the year 50, Paul received this information. And then you can see how this is lined up. It's long, short, long, short. That's called parallelism. And it was a way to assist people in memorizing. And this is what it said, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared. So this is just like an outline, you could say, to help people remember what was said by the apostles. And then he lists a number of names to whom Jesus is said to have appeared. To Peter, then to the 12, then to more than 500 at one time. And Paul adds, most of these people are still alive, although some of them have died. Then Jesus appeared to James, then to all of the apostles. And then Paul said, last of all, he appeared to me. Now notice we have 3 individual appearances here, to Peter, James, and Paul. And then you have 3 group appearances, to the 12, to the more than 500, and to all of the apostles. The group appearances are pretty important. We'll get to them in just a little while. But the individual appearances, Peter, James, and Paul, of course, Paul claims to be an eyewitness, but the Peter and James are pretty interesting because in Galatians chapter 1, an undisputed letter of Paul, Paul said that 3 years after his conversion, he went up to Jerusalem and he spent 15 days with Peter, the lead apostle, and he also saw James, the brother of the Lord. And then 14 years later, in Galatians chapter 2, Paul says 14 years later, he returned to Jerusalem and he met with the pillars of the church, and he names them Peter, James, and John. So now it's his second meeting with Peter and second meeting with James and his first meeting with John. And remember, Peter is the lead apostle. James is the brother of Jesus. And John was with Peter, one of Jesus' 3. John and Peter were 2 of Jesus' 3 closest disciples. So these are people you would want to consult on this. And Paul said he ran the gospel past them, that he had been preaching, to ensure that he was on message with them. And he said they were satisfied with it. They added nothing to what he said. So that's pretty cool. And then Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:11, after giving what he delivered to them, what he received, death, burial, resurrection, and the appearances, he says, whether I or they, in other words, the other apostles, this is what we preached, and this is what you believed. So that's pretty cool. So here's what we got first. How do we know the apostles claimed Jesus rose and appeared to them? For one, we've got Paul here in this text. Second, you have oral tradition. So we have this text we just looked at here, which goes back to the Jerusalem apostles. And then you have the speeches in Acts. Acts chapters 2, 10, 13, 17. You could even go to 22, 24, and 26, where Paul is defending himself and giving his testimony. In each of those, he's talking about the appearance of Jesus to him. But scholars regard these speeches in Acts as being summaries of what was preached. And anyway, it's a summary of the gospel message that's being preserved there. They are summaries of what's called kerygma, the official, formal, public proclamation of the apostles. And then you have written tradition. You have the 4 gospels that have the apostles saying Jesus rose and appeared to them. You've got Clement of Rome, who was probably a disciple of the apostle Peter. He mentions it. And you have Polycarp, who was also a disciple of the apostle John. He mentions the resurrection of Jesus, and that Jesus' disciples were really encouraged as a result of seeing Jesus. So notice what we have here. We've got 3 lines of evidence: Paul, oral tradition, and written tradition. And so Gary Habermas and I, when we were writing our book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, we wanted to try to make things easy to remember. So we just have the acronym here, POW, for Paul, oral tradition, written tradition. So if someone says to me, I'm talking to someone, and they say, well, how do you know that the apostles were claiming Jesus rose and appeared to them? I immediately think POW. I think Paul, oral tradition in the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, the speeches in Acts, And then written tradition, the four Gospels, Clement of Rome, and Polycarp. And all you've got 9 different sources here. So it's pretty cool. Good way to remember the evidence that Jesus, apostles claimed that Jesus rose and appeared to them. That's not to say they actually believed it, but it is to show that they were claiming it. Nobody really disputes that. So now what do we do with that? If Jesus' apostles claimed he rose and appeared to them, that leaves us with 2 options. Either he did not appear or he appeared. Can you think of a third option there? All right, let's focus on he did not appear. We have 2 options. They either knew that he did not appear or they did not know. In other words, they really believed he did appear to them. Let's focus on they did not know, or he did not appear, and they knew he did not appear. So they were either lying or they knew he didn't appear, but they were using the claim that he rose from the dead as a metaphor for something. So let's start off with lies. And here I'd say, can we really believe that they were lying about it? Well, we have a lot of reports from antiquity that these apostles were willing to suffer continuously, and they were willing even to die for their gospel proclamation. Now, if you want to know the names for that, now all these are in the book that Gary Habermas and I wrote, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. But I'll just give you an acronym that we came up with. I wish we had a better one. I don't really care for this one, but given all the different names, this is the best I could come up with. So it's Lieutenant J.P. Dopick. And so Lieutenant LT, that stands for Luke Tertullian. So that's Lieutenant LT, Luke Tertullian. And then J for John. You say, well, where does John talk about, the Gospel of John talk about the martyrdom of any of the apostles or their suffering? Well, in John chapter 21, Jesus and Peter, after his resurrection, and after he has helped them catch fish on the Sea of Galilee, Jesus and Peter take a walk along the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And there, Jesus tells Peter that he's going to be martyred. And he's going to be martyred. And Jesus tells him, hey, you can, now you're young, you can do what you want and go where you want. But there's going to come a day when you're old that people are going to take you and lead you where you don't want to go, and you're going to stretch out your hands. And John says at that point, this Jesus said to signify the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Now, John is probably writing this 25 to 30 years after Peter had been martyred by being crucified upside down. So the Gospel of John is actually reporting the martyrdom of Peter. So you got Lieutenant Luke Tertullian, then you have John, then the P is Paul. Paul talks about his being persecuted, all the things he went through, being shipwrecked, left for dead, all that kind of, stoned, whipped, thrown in prison, all that. 1 Corinthians 15, he dies daily. In other words, he is threatened with death daily by preaching the gospel. It was a dangerous occupation. So Paul talks about his persecution there. So Lieutenant J.P. and then Dopick, Dionysius of Corinth, Origen, Polycarp, Dionysius of Corinth, Origen, Polycarp, Ignatius, and Clement of Alexandria. Those are all the ones that talk about that. In fact, we could add another one. Yeah, Lieutenant J.J.P. Dopick. So the other J would be Josephus, because he mentions the martyrdom of James, the brother of Jesus. So you got Lieutenant J.J.P. Dopick. And if you want, you could say, even if you want to look at just the first century sources, you have Paul, John, Josephus, and Clement of Rome. Paul, John, Josephus, and Clement of Rome. There you have 4 sources from the first century that talked about how the disciple, oh, you could also throw an Acts as well. There's another one. Luke, well, you could put Acts because that talks about the persecution of the apostles. So yeah, oh, that's an A too. So that's nice. It's a vowel. We might be able to come up with a better acronym now. So there's 5 sources from the 1st century alone that talk about the persecution, the willing to die, and even the martyrdom of some Christians of the apostles in the 1st century. Now, why is that important? It doesn't show that what they believed is true, but it shows that they sincerely believed what they were proclaiming is true. Liars make poor martyrs. So the apostles were not only claiming Jesus rose and appeared to them, they actually believed it. They say, well, Mike, wait a minute. You've got Muslim jihadis who are willing to die for Islam. That doesn't mean Islam is true. That's correct. But it does mean that they believe it's true. You don't have someone go in and say, hey, I want to serve God, Allah. And they say, okay, we want you to strap this bomb on your back and go blow up 1,000 people here. And he's thinking, well, if I do that, let's see, Muhammad's a false prophet. The Quran is not from God. And if I do that, kill all those innocent people, I'm probably going to go to hell. Sign me up. No, he does it because they really believe Islam is true. And the same thing with Christians today, even those that are killed or martyred by the jihadis, like the 21 Coptic Christians who were put in orange jumpsuits and paraded on the beach and then beheaded. They died for what they believe is true, but for all they know, it could be false. But the apostles were different. They died for what they knew was true or knew was false. And there's a big difference between dying for what you believe is true and dying for what you know is false. Again, liars make poor martyrs. So the disciples, again, not only claimed Jesus rose and appeared to them, they truly believed it. So lying doesn't work. And in fact, I don't know anyone today, any scholars who would say the disciples lied about it. What about metaphor? Now, there are some scholars who will say this. So for example, John Dominic Crossan, he has gone around, he said, yeah, they really didn't believe that Jesus was raised physically from the dead. To say that the corpse was raised, he said, that would be theological yuck. That's what he calls it. He says resurrection was just a term that they used as a metaphor for saying that they can still experience Jesus in the breaking of bread during the Eucharist. They still think they sense his presence. Now, I've talked to Crossan. I've debated him. You can watch it if you want. It's on my YouTube channel. I've talked to him personally. He doesn't think God actually exists. He's a practicing atheist. He doesn't believe that there is any afterlife. So when he's saying a metaphor, he's saying that these Christians use resurrection as a metaphor, but Jesus actually didn't rise from the dead. It's just a metaphor for saying they can still think that they experience him during the Last Supper, the Eucharist. Well, what about that? Well, I look at what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. And when you get, the Corinthians are asking him some questions because there are some non-believers in Corinth that are telling the Christians that they're wasting their time because there is no afterlife, that this life is all there is. And so they're asking Paul some questions, and Paul responds about, okay, this is what the resurrection body's like. And before I tell you about that, let me tell you that Jesus' resurrection was part of the general resurrection that is spoken of in Judaism, that when God comes back to judge the world, he will raise the dead, some to judgment and some to eternal life. So Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:20, Christ is the first fruits of those who are asleep. In other words, he's the first to be raised from the dead with a resurrection body. It won't be like Lazarus, Jairus' daughter, the widow's son, who Jesus raised, and they were raised in the same body only to die again. No, they're going to be raised. Jesus was raised in a resurrection body. So then, when are we going to be raised? When are believers going to be raised? Now, today is the 8th of July, 2 days ago was the 11th anniversary of when my mom died. And if I went to her grave today, she was a strong believer. If I went to her grave today and exhumed the corpse, it would still be in there. Skeletal remains, probably some flesh still on it, would still be there. But according to Paul, her spirit is in heaven. He says to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord, 2 Corinthians 5:8. So when are the rest of us going to be resurrected, our bodies? Well, Paul answers that 3 verses later in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 23. He says, but each in his own order, Christ the firstfruits, after that, those who belong to Christ at his coming. And then he goes and he gives a basic argument. He says, look, if Christ was not raised, we're not going to be raised, because if Christ was the beginning of the general resurrection. So if he wasn't raised, we're not going to be raised. And if we're not going to be raised, this life is all there is. So let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Get all the ice cream you want today. Do whatever you want. Get all the weed you want. Whatever you want to do, just live for pleasure, because this life is all there is. But he goes on, Christ was raised. Therefore, we will be raised. Therefore, the Christian life is worth living. It wouldn't be worth living if Christ wasn't raised because of persecution. But it is worth living because Jesus was raised, and therefore we are going to be raised. Now, that argument makes no sense at all if they were just saying the resurrection was a metaphor for something. No, when they said resurrection, they really meant that Jesus rose from the dead, and that gives us hope for eternal life. So metaphor doesn't work. So now where are we at? Jesus' disciples claimed he rose from the dead and appeared to them. He did not appear to them, and they did not know. So in other words, it was either a hallucination, or Jesus had an identical twin who, after Jesus died, the identical twin showed up and confused them, deceived them. Let's focus a moment on hallucinations. Now, hallucinations, let's understand what a hallucination is. It's a false sensory perception. Most people, when they think of hallucinations, they think of a visual hallucination. They see something that isn't really there. But you can also have an audio hallucination where you hear something like a person calling your name, but no one actually called your name. Or you can have a hallucination where you smell something or taste something that isn't really there. Or you can have what's called a tactile hallucination. You remember when you got your first mobile phone, and you remember your first one, and you were going into either a lecture or a sermon, and you put it on silence. And while you're sitting there, you either thought you heard it or you felt it vibrate. And so you pulled your phone out and you looked at it for that text, and false alarm. Nobody loves me. And that is called a tactile hallucination, where you feel something, you think you feel something, but you really didn't. And then there's what's called a kinesthetic hallucination. That's where you have the sense of motion. All of us have had this at some time. Have you ever had a dream where you have the sense that you're falling and then you wake up? That is called a kinesthetic hallucination. Now, multiple studies have been done over the past century on hallucinations. And the group that is most likely to experience a hallucination are people who are grieving over the loss of someone they loved. And approximately 50% of them experience some sort of a hallucination. So when we think of hallucinations in relation to Jesus, it just makes sense, since 50% would experience a hallucination of someone they loved that just died. You would think that hallucinations are really a plausible explanation for this. But hang on, because even though 50% of those grieving the loss of a loved one experience a hallucination, only 7% experience a visual hallucination of that person. And the claim is that he appeared to Peter, then to the 12, then to more than 500. then to James, then to all of the apostles. And then last of all, Paul says, he appeared also to me. These are visual experiences. That's how it's reported in Acts. That's how it's reported in all the Gospels. That's how Paul reports it, that in 1 Corinthians, that Jesus had appeared to him, he says, in 1 Corinthians 9 and 15. So that's one reason why it's unlikely a hallucination. Not 50%, only 7% experience a visual hallucination. And yet, what do you have? 100% of Jesus' apostles claimed Jesus appeared to them. So that's one problem. A second problem is group hallucinations. I mentioned those a little earlier, the group appearances. Now, hallucinations are private occurrences in the mind of an individual. They have no external reality. So if I'm having a dream at night that I'm in Hawaii, I can't wake up my wife and say, honey, I'm having a dream. I'm in Hawaii. Go back to sleep. Join me in my dream. Let's have a free vacation. We're a little bit light on funds this summer. Let's have a free vacation. We can just dream it that we're there and it will be real to us. Now, she might go back to sleep. I might go back to sleep. We might both dream we're in Hawaii, but it is not the same dream. We are not participating in the same dream. And it's because why? Dreams are something that occur in the mind of an individual. They have no external reality. The same is true of hallucinations. So because of that, you can't have group hallucinations. Now, you could have a group optical illusion, like when a bunch of you are in a car on a sunny day and it looks like the road is wet ahead. That's an optical illusion. But that is different from a hallucination. And so to say that the disciples experience these grief hallucinations, it doesn't work because the percentage of percipients is too high. It's 100% rather than 7%. You have group hallucinations, which are impossible. And then you have Paul. Paul was not grieving over Jesus' death. He believed Jesus was a failed Messiah and a false prophet. So Jesus would have been the last person in the universe that Paul would have expected to see and wanted to see. So there's good reasons to reject the hallucination hypothesis. And of course, if Jesus' tomb was empty, the hallucinations wouldn't explain how it got empty. But I haven't brought in the empty tomb here. It's not one of those things that's granted by virtually 100% of scholars. So that's why I don't bring it up. All right. So that leaves us with the identical twin hypothesis. Oh, yes, Jesus was had an identical twin that were separated at birth. He didn't even know about it. And when he was crucified, his identical twin saw him and he said, you know what? I'm going to play a trick here. I'm going to come back and say that I'm Jesus since I look so much like him. And so he played the part and they believed he rose from the dead. Now, there's multiple problems with this. So, for example, I was in Romania earlier this year, and I gave the same lecture in Romania and for Easter. And afterward, these two sets of identical twins came up to me and they said, we really agree with what you said about the identical twins. So I asked them in the congregation, I said, do we have any identical twins here? And then these four raised their hand. I probably over the years have had 60, maybe 70 or 80 identical twins identify themselves when I've asked this question. And here's what's interesting about it. I'd say, can you fool your parents? Yes. For how long? Not long at all. And as soon as I start talking, I can fool them as long as I'm not talking. But as soon as I start talking, they know I'm not the other because of my facial expressions or my voice. It's easy to tell. And I said, do you have some really close friends? Yes. Can you fool them? Yes. For how long? Not long at all. Same thing. They know the difference because they've been around us long enough. It's impossible to fool them for long. Okay, so after the resurrection, Jesus is with them for some time. He appears to them in Jerusalem. He appears to them in Galilee. So they're with him for a little while. The book of Acts says he was with them for 40 days. They would have certainly, having traveled with him from 1.5 to 3 years, they would be able to tell this was not Jesus. And something else you got to take into consideration. Jesus wasn't just shot and killed. He wasn't just hanged. He wasn't just beheaded with a quick death. No, they scourged him. They tortured him. They gave him the brutal death on the cross, crucifixion, which was the most extreme torture back in the first century by the Romans. It was the worst way to die. So if you saw this is what the Romans had did to your lookalike, do you think you're going to come back and say, hey, I'm back? Of course not. You'd have to be a moron to do that, because the Romans are just going to grab you and say, all right, buddy, we're going to have some even more fun with you this time. I mean, if you were an identical twin or someone who looked like someone who was thought of as a rebel who was crucified, you're going to skip town. You're going to get out of there as quickly as you can. Now, folks, I only know one person over the years who have proposed the identical twin hypothesis. His name is Greg Cavan. He's an atheist philosophy professor. He wrote his PhD dissertation as an atheist, and he said, look, hallucinations doesn't work. Stolen body doesn't work. None of these natural hallucinations, none of them work. Legend, metaphor, they don't work. So that leaves one option. Since God doesn't exist, the only option is that Jesus must have had an identical twin brother who appeared to them, showed himself to them after Jesus was crucified. That's what his doctoral dissertation was. He's the only person I know of who took the identical twin hypothesis. I debated Greg Cavan in 2012. And before our debate, he said, hey, Mike, I want to ask you to do something. I said, what's that, Greg? He says, don't mention the identical twin hypothesis because I don't take it anymore. So the only person in the world I know of who took the identical twin hypothesis no longer takes it because he knows there's weakness to it. So folks, we've run out of things with he did not appear to them. So now the other option is he appeared to them. Now we're not quite home yet. So he survived. That would be one thing. He survived crucifixion, and then he appeared to them, and they thought he had been raised from the dead. But folks, you know, you've heard the rebuttals to this several times, I'm sure. The Romans were quite skilled at executing someone. And in fact, in antiquity, there are only 2 reports of a person who has survived crucifixion. Josephus reports of 3 of his friends being crucified during the fall of Jerusalem between 68 to 70 AD. And so he went to his friend, the Roman commander Titus, and asked him to spare their lives. And out of friendship to Josephus, he ordered that all 3 be removed from their crosses and provided the best medical care Rome could offer them. So they were removed and given medical attention, but 2 of the 3 still died. So that's a problem. The other, Herodotus mentions it, and he was removed alive, but we don't know anything about it. We don't know. Maybe he was just put on a cross to suffer for a while. Maybe he was just tied rather than nailed to the cross, and then he was removed and set free. We know nothing of this person. So those are the only 2 accounts in antiquity of a person surviving crucifixion, and they were removed while alive intentionally. There is no evidence that Jesus was removed while alive or that he was provided any medical care whatsoever. And folks, historians must go with the data. They can't just make wild, unfounded speculations for which there's not a scrap of evidence. They've got to go with the evidence. And with all the evidence we have for Jesus's death by crucifixion, without any good evidence to the contrary, the historian must conclude that Jesus was crucified and that the process killed him. In fact, one other thing we might throw in there is that even if Jesus had survived crucifixion, when he appeared to his disciples just a few days later, what would he have looked like? Would he have even been able to walk? What would he look like? He would have never been able to convince them, having been scourged, crucified, and hadn't eaten for several days, and now was severely dehydrated. If he could have survived at all, he would have been half dead. He would have convinced his disciples that he was barely alive, but no way resurrected with an immortal body. And so there are only a handful of people. In fact, I only know of 2 scholars today who would even suggest that Jesus survived his crucifixion. And both of them are so far out there on the fringe of the theological left that even most radical scholars just laugh at them. Nobody considers them to be credible, serious scholars. that leaves us with one other option. Jesus' disciples claimed he rose and appeared to them. He appeared to them, he died, and he rose. Now that's pretty cool, because I'll tell you what, that just excites me, because it tells me that what I had originally believed God had revealed to me by his Holy Spirit was now being confirmed by a sober-minded historical investigation that is based on facts so strongly supported by the data that even skeptical scholars are willing to acknowledge these facts. Now, the skeptics don't come to the conclusion that Jesus rose, but they don't have any plausible alternative explanations to offer in response. And so there's something that if you just kind of master some of those things I gave you, you'll be able to draw this on a napkin and share this with skeptics. I guess one final thing I'd share with you is that what's really cool about this for me is the reason I am still a Christian today is because of the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Now, Gary Habermas is one of my dearest friends. He's probably my best friend. And he's just making a funny face here, but he's a philosophy professor at Liberty University, leading expert in the world on the resurrection of Jesus. He and his wife, Eileen, have come to our house and spent a week with us every year for 27 years. This year will be 28 or 29. The only year that they missed was a few years ago during COVID, because his wife, Eileen, got COVID. So 1 year in all those, and more than 2.5 decades, only 1 year they missed. And Gary will tell you that, he loves apologetics. He sees this really important. I tease him. I tell him HBU, now Houston Christian University, is the best apologetics university in the world. And he agrees with me. Well, not really. Sometimes he gets upset with me because I claim these things, but yes, Houston Christian University provides the best apologetics program in the world, and you can do it entirely online as well. If you want information, you go to hc.edu/defend. Now, the reason I bring up Gary Habermas is because Gary, I called him in 1989, I believe it was, and I was really struggling with my faith during that time. I didn't know what to do. It's like I had heard objections against Christianity. I wasn't into apologetics that much at that time. I knew a little bit, but I just wasn't into it much. My master's degree was in New Testament studies. And but I started to question my faith. And so I called Gary and I said, Gary, I'm just, you know as well as I do that there are a lot of scholars out there that don't think Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels. And if they didn't write them, how do we know we can trust them? And this is really rocking my faith. And he said, Mike, did Jesus rise from the dead? I said, yeah. He says, why do you believe that? I said, well, you have what you call the minimal facts approach. You take evidence that is so strongly supported by the data that the vast majority of scholars, including skeptics, are willing to grant these as facts. And so you can just take those if you want. There are plenty of other facts, but you can build a strong historical case for the resurrection using only those facts. And so even if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John didn't write the Gospels, even if that were the case, we still get to the resurrection of Jesus. He said, that's right, Mike. So why are you allowing the authorship of the Gospels to rock your faith? Yeah, it's an important topic, but it doesn't mean, even if it were the case, Christianity is still true. Because, Mike, if Jesus rose, he did so in the year 30 or 33, and the first gospel wasn't written until probably 3 decades later. So Christianity was true when Jesus rose. It was true 5 years later, 10 years, 20, 30 years later. It was true one day before the first gospel was written. So how could, if the first gospel was not written by who it's attributed to, how would that negate the truth of Christianity? I said, well, it wouldn't. He said, well, don't let this rock your faith then. Put it in perspective. I said, well, I never thought of it that way, Gary. Well, what do you do about all the alleged contradictions and errors in the Gospels? He said, Mike, did Jesus rise from the dead? I said, yeah. He said, Mike, we got answers to a lot of the alleged errors and contradictions, but let's say we're wrong in all of those. Let's just say inerrancy is not the true doctrine. Let's say that there are errors and contradictions in the Gospels. Would Christianity still be true given Jesus's resurrection? I said, yeah. He said, then why are you allowing alleged errors and contradictions to rock your faith? All right, I see where you're going with this, Doc. But what do you do with the genocide text in the Old Testament? I mean, Mike, read my lips. Did Jesus rise from the dead? That phone call was a game changer, a life changer for me, because at that point, I realized that no matter what objection came up, if Jesus rose from the dead, it's game, set, match. Christianity is true, period. I don't have to know the answers to everything. We don't have answers to everything. Nobody, no worldview has the answers to everything. Even atheists have trouble. They can't really explain plausibly why we have the universe here. They can't explain why the universe we do have has the strong, inescapable appearance of design. They can't explain human consciousness, how that consciousness would even have come through the evolutionary process. And they don't really have plausible explanation for the resurrection of Jesus. So every worldview has challenges, okay? We don't have to know all the answers. But if Jesus rose, Christianity is true. And that means he loves us, he cares for us, that no matter what we go through, no matter who wins this presidential election and what happens to our country, if our country goes down the toilet after this, you know, life will be a little tougher for us, but it really doesn't matter because we are citizens of heaven. Paul says our citizenship is in heaven. And we know that God loves us, and this life is just a testing ground. So we can be encouraged by this. So I hope this does encourage you by presenting a case for the resurrection of Jesus and what it means in our lives. So let me go ahead now and open it up for some, I'll turn it back to you, Gabby. And if you want to open it up for some Q&A, I'm open for it.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was about to do. But oh my gosh, Mike, that was astounding. I mean, I think that was probably one of the best practical teachings on the resurrection I've ever heard. I don't know if
Thank
you
you.
guys agree with me, but I mean, that was amazing. So thank you
Yeah, it was.
so much for this. I'm so glad I recorded it. So okay, guys, if you have any questions, now's your chance. And if you
So,
don't,
Mike-
it's okay too.
Yes, sir.
So Mike, I listened recently to Sean McDowell's explanation on the martyrdom of the apostles, and I think he came to the conclusion through his research, 3-year research, and everything he was able to find, that they could say that there were, I think he said 4 to 6 that we can confirm outside of the Bible and with almost complete certainty that were martyred for the faith. Where do you lie on that? I know there's for a lot of years, I myself, talked about all 12 of the apostles and,
Sure.
that kind of thing. And now that's a little bit different now. What's your take on that?
It's a good question. Now, I came to a different conclusion than Sean, but I studied it before he did. And then I served as an external reader for his doctoral dissertation, where he did his research. So I would defer to him because he has studied this a whole lot more in depth than I have. But what I would say is we can be confident of Peter because we have very early and multiple independent sources. You have John, you have Clement of Rome. I mean, just those two alone, they are independent. And Clement of Rome was probably a disciple of the Apostle Peter. And he talks about the martyrdom of Peter and Paul. And then you got it in John, referring to Peter's martyrdom 3 decades earlier. So we can be pretty confident of Peter. You got Paul, I mean, his martyrdom is attested by Clement of Rome and others. But Clement of Rome is 1st century. And then Paul himself testifies that he was persecuted horribly and left for dead and stoned many times when he could have died. So when you're in that kind of a position, here's what we're trying to show through it. Not necessarily their deaths, but their willingness to die. So let's say Peter is martyred, okay, and Paul is martyred. Let's say those were the only two for which we had record that they were martyred. The fact that the others were willing to continue proclaiming the same message that their colleagues had proclaimed with and got martyred and were martyred for, that shows that they were willing to be martyred as well, whether they actually ended up to be martyred or not. All those sources that I talked about, Lieutenant JJP Dopick, JJPA Dopick, they talk about the disciples' willingness to suffer and their willingness to die, and that some of them actually did. So you got Peter, I think, is sound. Paul is very sound. James, the brother of Jesus, very sound. One that I've been convinced of, you've got James, the son of Zebedee, in the book of Acts. He was killed in Acts chapter 12. Herod killed him with a sword. Sean does not think that James was martyred. James, the son of Zebedee, that is. Now, I do, and the reason I do is because you can recall that at one point, this is reported in Matthew and Mark, James and John came to Jesus and said, "Hey, we want to ask you a favor, right? We want to sit at your right and left." And Jesus says to them,
Drink the cup.
"Can you be baptized with? Can you drink the cup of which I'm going to drink?" Yep, we could do that. Can you be baptized with the baptism with which I'm about to be baptized? Yeah, we can do that too. Well, you will drink the cup I'm about to drink, and you will be baptized with my baptism, but to whom to sit on my left and right, that's determined by the Father. And, they're walking away from that saying, I wish we'd never asked him now, but seems to me that that is referring to their martyrdom. And we know that, I'm sorry, Sean does think James, the son of Zebedee, was martyred. Where we disagree is on John. He thinks John lived and died a normal death, whereas I think that saying of Jesus means that John, the son of Zebedee, is going to be martyred as well. And the early church fathers disagree on what happened to John. One of them does say that he lived a long time and died a normal death, a natural death. But other church fathers says that he died, that he was martyred. So the early church fathers aren't all in agreement on all these things. So in some of them, we just have to throw up our hands and say, don't know. I think for me, Peter, James, the son of Zebedee, Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul, no one really disputes those. We can be certain that they died as martyrs. I also think that James, the son of Zebedee, died as a martyr. And I think John was as well, and maybe some of the others. But what we can know with confidence is all of them endured persecution, and they were willing to die as martyrs for the gospel.
On this topic of martyrdom, do you mind breaking down your acronym for me one more time?
Yeah. Now, this is not to say that they were all martyred. It is to say that they were persecuted for their faith. Okay.
Sure.
And of course, willing to die. So you've got Lieutenant Luke Tertullian. And then there's JJPA, John, Josephus, Paul, and Acts. So Luke would be the Gospel of Luke. Oh, forgive me. You got to get rid of the A. It's not the Gospel of Luke. It is Acts. So that's what the L is for lieutenant. It's the book of Acts. But maybe what I should do is get rid of the L and just put an A in there so I got another vowel. If any of you can come up with a better acronym, I am all ears, okay? So the Luke Tertullian, Luke is referring to the book of Acts. Luke Tertullian. Now we got JJP, John, Josephus, and Paul. And then Dopic, Dionysius of Corinth, Origen, Polycarp, Ignatius, and Clement of Rome.
Can you do the parable of the lost son and the key of F?
It's been a while. Is that Dave?
Yeah, it is.
Let's see.
Dude.
Feeling footloose and frisky, the featherbrained fellow forced his fond father to fork over the farthings. He flew far to foreign fields and frittered his fortune, feasting fabulously with faithless friends. Finally, facing famine and fleeced by his fellows in folly, he found himself a feed flinger in a filthy farmyard. Fairly famished, he fain would have filled his frame with foraged food from the fodder fragments. Phooey, my father's flunkies fare far fancier. The frazzled fugitive fumed feverishly, frankly facing facts. Frustrated by failure and filled with foreboding, he fled forthwith to his family. Falling at his father's feet, he floundered forlornly. Father, I have flunked and fruitlessly forfeited family favor. But the faithful father, forestalling further flinching, frantically flagged the flunkies to fetch forth the finest fatling and fix a feast. The fugitive's fault-finding frater frowned on the fickle forgiveness of former father-in-law. His fury flashed, but fussing was futile, for the far-sighted father figured, such filial fidelity is fine, but what forbids fervent festivity? For the fugitive is found. Unfurl the flags, with fanfares flaring, let fun and frolic freely flow. Former failure is forgotten, folly forsaken. Forgiveness forms the foundation for future fortitude.
You all now you all know why Mike and I are such good friends because, dude, that is my favorite thing ever. I love it.
Yeah,
Mike,
that
could
was
you do that
sick.
5 times fast for me, please? All right, one more question for me and then I'm done. In the beginning of your presentation, I think you said, if I heard this right, majority of scholars on the resurrection are non-believers.
No, probably a majority of New Testament scholars are non-believers. So,
Okay.
yeah, that might be the case, though. Maybe a majority of scholars who write on the resurrection, and there are many, hundreds of them, a majority of them may not be Christians. I don't know. Gary Habermas, he's doing his magnum opuses right now, 4 volumes,
Right.
each of which are averaging 1,000 pages. And the 4th volume, I mean, he's starting to talk about percentages in the 1st volume. He talks about percentages. But the 4th volume, he's actually going to be providing quotes and opinions of all these different scholars and naming them.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions before we wrap this up? Speak now or forever hold your peace.
I think I might have a question, but it wasn't any name mentioned tonight. My first I heard of the martyrdom of the apostles, but a while back I was watching some content online and I came across the name Perpetua. Does that ring a bell at all?
It doesn't.
Okay. That's okay. That's all.
Thanks, Daniel.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I have not heard that name.
Haven't either, so I don't know.
Me either.
But thank you guys so much for coming out tonight. And if we can all give our little round of applause for Mike. Thank you so much for coming. We've thoroughly enjoyed this. So
Well, thanks for having me.
yes, of course. And if you ever want to come back, we'd be more than happy to have you. I'm sure we will do a resurrection talk again in the future because
Oh, yeah.
we're never going to stop talking about it.
Yes.
Good.
Yeah,
You know,
Mike.
I enjoyed it.
Yeah, Mike,
Thanks,
thank
Bill.
you so much for your time. having you, somebody that's so knowledgeable on the subject matter, being willing to set aside time for us, and really, you gave us such a great presentation. I mean, there was no stone that you left unturned in that presentation, and I'm really thankful for that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm hoping to take this. I did this in front of a group last year of about 500, and I asked them, it was in Texas, and I said, from what I've just given you, would you want to see that in a very small, short book? And like 300 of them, 400 of them raised their hands that, yeah, that'd be great. Do you guys think, is that something that you think would be good that people would like to have? Just something like that in a short book to really
Yeah.
help you learn it?
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely something
Definitely.
you can purse or your pocket.
So that's
I'm
something
on
I'll start
Amazon trying to
looking
order now.
at.
I know somebody that could design any artwork you'd need for it too.
Yeah,
Sorry,
you'd
that's a
li-
shameless plug for my daughter. She's a graphic designer. Sorry,
Oh,
shameless
okay,
plug.
gotcha.
Not me.
I'm totally biased, 100%.
Not me. The other one.
But she's good.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, those little charts I have are kind of well, they're not that good. That little logic tree. So, well, God bless you guys. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And yeah, thanks for inviting me, Dave. We'll see you guys.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I look forward to the range.
Yeah,
Mhm.
man. Give me a holler. Let's do it.
All right,
Is
man.
there anybody that wants to pray us out before Mike heads out?
I'll
Not
pray
it.
us out. Father God, thank you so much for truth. Thank you for your unending truth. Thank you that it's true yesterday, today, forever. Lord, that we can learn these things, that we can stand boldly in your faith and in your word. Father, we just wow. I just what a textbook example of how to present the gospel through the resurrection tonight through an expert like Mike. And I know he doesn't like me calling him an expert, but that's just what that was an expert presentation. So God, thank you for that. Thank you for everybody who was here. And may we leave changed and never walk the same again. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
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 Okay, so before you guys leave, really quick, Mike, you're free to go. Thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your night. Or
Thanks,
yes,
bunch.
Georgia, right?
Good night, all.
He's in Georgia. Anyway, so next week we're gonna challenge you guys. So when we meet next week, we're not gonna have a guest speaker. We want to challenge y'all. Prove the resurrection to us. We are the atheists here. We want you to teach us, to share the gospel with us, and we're not gonna just leave you out to dry. We're gonna help walk you through it, but that's what we're gonna do next week. Does that sound good to
Technically
everyone else?
not next,
Oh yeah.
Not next
next-
week. I'm sorry. Next meeting.
it's the 29th.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So study up.
That
Yeah,
gives three,
challenge accepted.
Perfect.
that gives 3 weeks.
Yes. And if you guys need any help with anything, finding resources, finding the website, just message me, message Mark, Dave. We've got the Facebook group, the Reasons for Hope app group, phone numbers. All good?
Yep.
All right. Thank you guys so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your night.
Yeah, you too.
Bye.
Peace.
Bye.
Peace out.